Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa and Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, both retired from the Indian Foreign Service, have been posted in China, speak Mandarin fluently. Ambassador Deepa Gopalan has also served in Japan and Sweden, amongst other countries. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa in Poland was in charge of Russia and the former Eastern Europe here in Delhi. Ambassadors, both of you, welcome to the Print debates.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. Pleasure to be here.
So in this debate, we usually discuss the burning issue of the day and the recently concluded Quad meeting between the 4 foreign ministers, which is what the Quadrilateral is about. The US, India, Australia, and Japan, of course, the host country being Japan, was held in Tokyo a couple of days ago. The US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, had a very interesting comment in the run-up to the Quad meeting, and I will quote, and he said, as partners in this Quad, it is more critical now more than ever that we collaborate to protect our people and partners from the CCP's exploitation, corruption, and coercion. And the CCP, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party's exploitation, corruption, and coercion. Both your comments. Ambassador Deepa Gopalan, you first, please.
I think, Jyoti, certainly, his comments have to be taken in the context of US-China relations at this point of time, and I think the upcoming elections and so on. So it was a kind of perhaps a slightly strong statement, which we didn't see from any of the other foreign ministers. So right. You have to put it in that particular context. Mm. And as you know, it elicited a response from the Chinese too. But I'll leave it to Anil to say what he has to say on it.
So Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, what do you think? Do you think that Secretary of State Pompeo should have made this strong comment? You work in the Indo-Pacific, you work very closely with the Australians. What do you think?
Well, I think this was an expected kind of statement from Secretary of State Pompeo. As we all know, there's been an ongoing dispute for quite some time between China and the United States, mainly because of economics, but also on geopolitics and on the issue of technology and technological supremacy. So as far as US and China are concerned, this has entered a very difficult and a contentious phase. As far as the other Quad countries are concerned, they've been feeling the pressure from the Chinese for quite some time now. And I think one of the reasons why the Quad has come about in the first place, starting in 2017, once again, when it was resurrected, was because of the aggressive policies of China in the South China Sea in particular, but also all around the world.
Right.
In context, of course, we can see what's happening in Senkaku Islands, the Taiwan Straits, the Western Pacific, and Australia, which is also in the line of fire of China on trade issues in particular. And as far as India is concerned, the line of actual control, which we all know about, is now a very difficult border issue between India and China. And in the background of the fact that the ASEAN cannot put up a united front, there is also dispute on the freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Fishing is disallowed. And also questions are raised about the countries, the territorial claims of China under the UNCLOS.
Right. So, Ambassador, we'll come to all these issues, but I'm just wondering, you seem to think that what Secretary Pompeo said was par for the course. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yes, of course, it was par for the course.
But you seem to be a bit cautious, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan. Is that...
No, I mean, in the sense...
Yeah.
Right. In the sense, I mean, whatever Anil is saying is absolutely right. And I think the Quad has come together. And we do know that that probably the elephant in the room is China, and everyone's aware of it. But it just depends on how, in the context of the Quad, is what I was responding to you to your question. It was in the context of the Quad, and the fact that Pompeo made these statements on the eve of the Quad meeting. And, we've been very particular. Say, I'm looking at it from an Indian perspective. I mean, as I say, again, everything that Anil says is right, but we've been looking at it from the Indian perspective and been talking about in every one of our statements, the importance of inclusivity and that other countries have a vital and strategic interest in this region and so on. But as we discuss further, you'll find that in our statement also, it isn't as if we haven't alluded to China, but not as directly as Secretary of State.
So why not? Why not be direct about it? After all, as Pompeo said, and again, I'm going to quote from his comments, he said, we see it. So this is, he's referring to this Chinese Communist Party's exploitation, corruption, and coercion. And he says, we see it in the South and East China Sea, the Mekong, the Himalayas, the Taiwan Straits. And he's obviously referring to the clash or to the intrusion by the Chinese PLA troops in Ladakh. So why be so cautious, Deepa?
I don't think it's really caution, Jyoti. I'm sure that within the context of the Quad consultations, I'm sure they all talked about this. But is this really something that any one of us, and really those people who are practitioners of diplomacy, would say in an open public forum? On the eve of these talks? Probably each one has their own way of tackling diplomacy. It comes from their own positions of strength, I suppose. And if you will see in the context of the statements that issued after the Quad, each one has its own nuances. Each one of the countries, the participants have. So I think we have to look at it in that context, and we also have to take it perhaps in the context of the upcoming elections in the US.
Right. Anil, your comments on the Indo-Pacific, you work very closely across this region, especially with the Australians. But I want to know, are the Australians as much on board in the creation of this Quad? And also vis-a-vis India, do you think that, with Pompeo saying things as bluntly as this, in a sense, it took the pressure off India to not say it?
Yes, of course. I think the Australians have been feeling the heat, as I told you. In fact, in the last few years, there's been undue Chinese influence in Australian politics. There's been pressure on the Australians on the trade front. There was a massive cyber attack on Australian installations. And as a result of that, they've come up with a new strategy white paper on defense. They've come out with a policy on cybersecurity, which aims mainly to counter these attempts by the Chinese to infiltrate the Australian society. And on top of that, we had the problem when the Australians wanted an independent probe into the origin of the novel coronavirus in the context of WHO. And that's when the Chinese aggression really came to the fore. So at the moment, Australia is very much on board on what the Quad in general is saying.
Right.
And there is a pushback against Chinese policy.
So at the risk of pushing this argument, Deepa, let me ask you, you've been ambassador in Japan. Do you think that the Japanese are as cautious about the Quad as the Indians seem to be?
The Japanese are really the ones who kind of gave birth to the concept of the Quad. If you remember, the Quadrilateral security dialogue actually came from Prime Minister Abe. So, they have certainly had an interest in it. They have kept it going. And the fact that this foreign ministers, the second meeting of foreign ministers was held in person and in Tokyo soon after Prime Minister Suga has come, I think also signals something in itself, that Japan continues to be committed to the concept of the Quad. But in the context of China, you've got to just understand their close relationship. I mean, there's an economic interdependence, and they are neighbors. Also China is a major security threat, certainly to Japan. So Japan has tread a rather cautious line as far as China is concerned. But I do recall that soon after Prime Minister Suga was sworn in, and I think his first conversations that he had with various world leaders, he was asked about China, and he said that where our interests are concerned, that I will be as assertive as anybody else. So Japan, again,
what does that mean, that he will be as assertive as anybody else?
Well, in the sense that there is a threat to the Senkakus, as Anil has just said, and you've had the intrusions which have really spiked in the last year or so. And, Japan is doing what it has to do. One is building alliances with other countries, or, partnerships with other countries, greater naval cooperation with other countries. On the other hand, it's also increasing its own military budget, its defense budget. And so there is that, on one hand, that is going on. But there is also, as one says, and I think this is also our own dilemma. After all, India and China are neighbors. We can't change geography. So when there are disputes, and, unfortunately, in both cases, I think the aggressor, insofar as Senkaku's or our Ladakh situation is concerned, is an assertive and militaristically strong China. But, we have to be able to I think, give importance to dialogue as part of the process, and certainly not exacerbate the situation, which is already bad, by, making statements like this. So I think that's where the Japanese come from, and to an extent us too.
So what do you think, Anil? Do you agree that India should be more cautious? I would say that if Pompeo has made these statements, it gets you off the hook. You agree with, you're part of the Quad, so you're basically agreeing with what Pompeo is saying, and so therefore you're on board.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think each country is free to make statements on what they feel on the situation is, and the level of escalation that they have faced at the moment. That's exactly what is happening with the Quad countries. Their experiences with the Chinese aggressiveness is different. As far as India is concerned, there's one important difference. India is not part of a security alliance, whereas Japan and Australia are with the United
Do you think
States.
India should be a part of, how does it really matter whether you call it an alliance, an agreement, a framework, a part of the Quadrilateral meeting? You are face-to-face, your Indian troops are face-to-face with Chinese PLA troops in Ladakh. How should it matter to you what you
So I think that was clarified very clearly by Foreign Minister Jaishankar when he said that India will work will work with countries based on issues. And that he has already ruled out a formal alliance. So we have that as a background. And I think India wants to maintain its freedom, to exercise its judgment, depending on different situations as they arise. At the moment, the only country which has a land border with China is India. Mm-hmm. And there are, obviously, the line of actual control is the main issue that India and China face, along with the trade and economic issues, which we've been facing for quite some time now. And this is the way we deal with it, because we have decided that at the moment, while we will go along with the Quad in terms of consultations and forming common approaches to various issues that have arisen as a result of aggressive Chinese policies, right, politically and economically. But we are not going to be ones who will go in for a formal alliance at the moment. That's very clear as far as the Indian government is concerned. Keeping that in mind, I think this is the right line to take at the moment.
Right. So you don't think a formal alliance is necessary. But I'm going to ask you both of you are Chinese speakers, Mandarin speakers. You've served in China, the two of you. Deepak, if you could explain to me, and this is a question that we've been grappling with for the last 5.5 months since the Chinese aggressed or intruded into Indian territory. What do you think? Why are they there in the first place? Is this because of some 1959 claim line that very few of us know about?
Jyoti, I really wouldn't claim to be a China expert any longer. Once was in China, spoke Mandarin, but of course I follow it like any other citizen. And really the response to your question is that nobody really knows. And I think E.M. Jaishankar himself said, I think why they have done what they have done right now is up to a lot of speculation, and nobody really knows the reason. So I really couldn't give a direct response to it.
But when you speak to your, your diplomatic colleagues in other countries, you've served in Japan, but what do they say? What do the Japanese say, for example? You already alluded to the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, which is what the Chinese call them, dispute. But is everybody as flabbergasted as we are, as India is, on this intrusion by the Chinese?
I think in the case of the Senkaku Teoyu, as you call it, I think there was, the provenance of that whole dispute is a little more, precise in the sense that it was always there, the simmering dispute. And, in fact, it could even go back to the 19th century when the Chinese first started claiming those islands. But more recently, it flared up. It was in 2012 when the Japanese government of the day decided to buy 3 of those islands. And, this then set off this whole wave of anti-Japan sentiment in China and so on. And then they started the incursions into the air and the water space around the Senkakus. So it's much more specific in that sort of thing, in that sort of context, because the spiking of this, I think this conflict over there, you can almost date it right in the particular context now from 2012. But, as far as our border is concerned, the LAC is concerned, is that, yes, we signed those agreements, a couple of agreements, and we made sure that peace and tranquility did pervade over all these years. So whatever made them, come in the way that they did and make the situation what it is now. So what was the reason for that? I don't think anybody knows.
Anil, what do you think? You've worked on the Russia desk some years ago in Delhi. The BRICS meeting is coming up. Prime Minister Modi is going to participate in it, albeit over video. So what do you think? What are the other countries saying about this aggression by China into India?
Well, as you know, Jyoti, there have not been too many statements.
Why do you think? That's interesting, isn't it?
Well, because, the other countries are not very clear as to what the origin of this issue is. As Deepa just said, there's very little which is understood about the motivations of the Chinese as to why they have actually undertaken the action they have undertaken on these islands.
Do you think it's perhaps because that a lot of us, including India actually, we're so economically independent on the Chinese? And that's why all these other countries, whether it's BRICS or anybody else, is not making these critical statements of China?
Well, that is certainly a very important factor. But I think equally important is the fact that no one wants to pass a judgment on an issue which they do not know much about. But obviously, China is an important player economically in the world today. Many countries are dependent on China, including the Quad countries. I mean, it's not as if the Quad is not dependent. There's a lot of interdependency. And they're tackling it in their own manner. But those who are not really involved, as normally happens, they tend to keep away. And we've seen that repeatedly over time. In fact, even in the United Nations, if you look at this issue, it is not something which is figured prominently. And both India and China also, to an extent, feel that this should be resolved bilaterally. That's the way the negotiations have been going, and consultations are continuing, while both sides are beefing up their own defenses to defend their own positions.
So if you remember in 2017, when the Doklam crisis was taking place, and one of the reasons that we were told that the crisis was finally resolved, although that was in a third country in Bhutan, was because the BRICS meeting was coming up in China, in Xiamen in China, and Prime Minister Modi was to attend the BRICS summit. So the Indian side told the Chinese that, listen, you have to back off in Bhutan because there's no way that the PM is going to go to the Chinese BRICS summit if there is still a confrontation on the border. So Deepa, what do you think? Now the PM is going to a BRICS summit. What do you make of it?
Jyoti, there are a lot of reasons people gave. Some of them are a little facile, I think. Perhaps it was one of the elements insofar as resolving the Doklam crisis was concerned. But I think it also was to the extent of, the very long negotiations that both countries had, if you recall at that point of time, both in Beijing and in Delhi. It was a long process of negotiations. So to really pin it on just the fact of the BRICS summit and Prime Minister Modi going for it, I don't think it was only that. And again, if you see what has happened is recently, yes, Prime Minister Modi will be there at the BRICS summit virtually, but recently you had the RIC, and you did have Jaishankar meeting Wang Yi there. And something did come out of it. how that has improved the situation on the ground, I really don't know. And I don't think any one of us knows. These negotiations are so sensitive that I think there is not much use in bringing it out into public debate. Already there is just far too much of public debate, which in a way ties the hands of both the countries. And, being part of this process, I can see that. And I have some amount of sympathy for our own negotiators when they're on one hand negotiating with the Chinese, and the other hand having to also respond to all kinds of things that our press says, rightly or wrongly.
Well, as journalists, I think it's our job to ask questions, but I have to ask you, Anil, you have worked on the Russia desk. Now the BRICS meeting is being hosted by the Russian side by President Vladimir Putin. Do you think that one of the reasons why Prime Minister Modi is participating in this conference is because the India-Russia relationship is very close, especially on the strategic front? And by that, I mean that India is still enormously dependent on Russia for its defense hardware. And you don't want the Russians to make any statements on the India-China crisis.
Well, you're right. As far as the relationship with Russia is concerned, I would completely agree with that. I think we have a very close relationship that's continued for many, many years. But I don't think that is the only reason. I think the BRICS summit is a virtual meeting, as we all know. This is not a forum where Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi are going to talk to each other about what's happening on the border.
We are going to share the same screen. It's almost as good, isn't it? In times of COVID, there isn't that much of a difference.
Well, they're talking about a different subject, and they're not going to talk about the line of actual control or what's happening there. That's being left to the negotiators, the people from the military at the moment. Summits on resolving an issue like this happen when it's the last stage. If you resort to leadership taking up these issues prematurely, it can actually backfire on you. So I think we are in the right process, and that's how it's going to be. I don't think we can expect anything out of the BRICS summit on the line of actual control.
So last couple of questions, Ambassador Deepa Wadhwa. You served in Japan, you know the Japanese really well. Now, there have been reports, including in the Japanese media, that some Japanese companies do not want to relocate from China to India because of tariffs that the Indian government will apply to these companies. So, if the India-Japan relationship is so good, why would they insist on that?
Jyoti, there are many pillars of this relationship. It is really, as we call it, a special strategic and global partnership. And there are many pillars. And EM, when he was, in Tokyo, the last couple of days, he's also had, as part of this, he's had bilateral talks with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Motegi. And of course, they have talked about a lot of issues, which also included economic issues and economic cooperation. Right. Now, what has happened really on this whole thing about supply chains has been that Japan itself is trying to move some very key industries back from China into Japan and has set up a fund for it. 10% of that fund is for them to diversify these supply chains to ASEAN, and they have also added India and Bangladesh. So this is going to be a process that's going to take some time. I am sure that, whenever you move, particularly when companies move, they don't move for political reasons. They also want to make sure that there's sound economic reasons to do so. And one of the things would be to have a good propitious and a good economic environment in India to invest. And I think the Indians government, as I understand, are also taking the necessary steps forward to see what is it that will attract more Japanese companies. Japanese companies are already here, and investment has been growing. But how do we attract more of these Japanese companies, and in particular, those who are relocating from China? But I must tell you, since we're talking about the Quad, since this was supposed to be about the Quad, there has been talk about supply chain resilience, which has been mentioned by many of the countries in the context of the Quad, particularly the US, Australia, and us. And in the bilateral talks between Motegi and Jaishankar, also the whole issue of this, the two commerce ministers had talked about a supply chain resilience initiative, where we will work together in the context of the Quad. to look at diversifying supply chains. So I think we're at the beginning of the process. Let's hope that something does come out of this, and it must.
So, in terms of the supply chain, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, the US is going in for elections, in less than a month from now. Do you think it's too soon for us to talk about, a re-diversification of the supply chain, if you like? Although the US-India trade relationship hasn't been that great, or despite the fact that we've had Howdy Modi and Namaste Trump, two big events in the US and in India respectively. So in a sense, whether it's BRICS or whether it's the Quad, on the trade front at least, or things don't seem to work that well.
Well, it's like this. The Supply Chain Resilience Initiative came about because of the common desire between Australia, Japan, and India to work with the ASEAN to make sure that there is a shifting of base as far as critical technologies are concerned away from China. And Australians have also got an added element about critical minerals and technologies.
Right.
You also mentioned in the statement this time around.
So what about the critical minerals and technologies? What about
So critical minerals are things like lithium, for instance,
right,
where 90% of the processing has been done in the past in China. And that is because it is a polluting industry, and the Chinese took it upon themselves to locate the processing facilities on their territory, knowing fully well that in future these will become very, very important going forward as far as industry is concerned. And that's exactly what has happened. But we saw a problem when some time ago, when there was a dispute between China and Japan, that the Chinese were willing to actually put pressure on Japan by denying them the critical minerals which go into very important industries in telecom and in computers and chips, etc. It also has many applications in the automobile industry. So therefore, it's very important that these countries feel secure in the future. And this is only an example. Lithium is only an example. There are many other such critical minerals which will become important for industry going forward. And moving them away and diversifying them into other countries would give a sense of security to all these countries. And that is why the Quad countries have come together and have talked about this issue.
And you think that could happen so that India could benefit from this, from the diversification, especially of the rare earths and these materials?
Yes, definitely. I think India would be a major beneficiary if that happens. And especially if we can locate some of these into India. For example, the Niti Aayog has already sanctioned 3 processing facilities about a year ago, looking at the Indian program of e-mobility. And that's already on the card. So I think what is required is coordination and making sure that the raw material is available, and at the same time we have the technology available for processing.
Right. Ambassador Deepa, I can't let you go without asking you whether you know Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and tell us a nice little anecdote about him and yourself. And so, yeah.
I think, Jyoti, when you're an ambassador in a country, you get to meet most of the leaders. And he was chief cabinet secretary with Prime Minister Abe. And innumerable other delegations that I have taken to meet Prime Minister Abe. And Prime Minister Abe visited India many times while I was there, including as a chief guest in 2014 on our Republic Day parade.
Right.
So in that context, of course, the interaction with Prime Minister Suga hasn't been very close, but I have met him on occasion. And there's not really an anecdote, but I do recall one particular thing that soon after Prime Minister Abe had been invited here as a chief guest, and after he had attended our Republic Day parade as our chief guest, and back in Tokyo, I remember Prime Minister Suga saying to me that what a great honor it had been for Japan to be invited as a chief guest, and I recall that very very acutely. But it's a good relationship, and I think we can see continuity in Prime Minister Suga, continuity of Prime Minister Abe's policies, and I think continuity of the process that was set in place in 2000, really, in strengthening our relations between our two countries.
Well, that's a nice, sweet little story. And yes, you're right. The India-Japan relationship is a really lovely one. We don't know too much about it, unfortunately, at least, as diplomats, you guys work so closely together. But we wish that you would talk about it much more because Japan is quite a country. But thank you so much for your time, both of you, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. Please watch the print debates, log on to our channel, subscribe to us, tell us what you think. And thank you so much for watching.
Thanks, Jyoti. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.